Where is she? Evelyn Whitmore's voice sliced through the kitchen before the sun had fully cleared the line of bare maple trees beyond the estate, and for a second, even the espresso machine seemed to hesitate. The Whitmore home was never truly quiet. Not with 2 floors of polished marble, a glass breakfast room that caught every echo, and a schedule packed so tightly it moved like clockwork. But this morning the rhythm was off. The coffee tasted wrong. The fruit tray hadn't been touched. One of William Whitmore's silk ties hung half out of a drawer upstairs like a white flag no one had noticed. 8-year-old Ethan sat at the end of the long breakfast table in his school blazer, eyes wet, pushing scrambled eggs around his plate with a trembling fork because they weren't cut the way he liked. Chloe Whitmore came in barefoot and annoyed, one earring on, one off, her prom dress still wrinkled in its plastic cover, and stopped short when she saw the steam rising from the wrong mug at her mother's place. "Why is this decaf?" she snapped, though no one answered her. Near the windows, Margaret Whitmore remained perfectly still in her chair, one hand resting on the silver head of her cane, the other hovering beside a pill organizer that had not been opened. The old woman's eyes moved once, slowly, toward the empty service door. That was when William strode in, already on a Bluetooth call, suit jacket over one shoulder, irritation rolling off him like heat from blacktop in July. "I asked for the navy tie," he muttered, not to anyone in particular, then looked up long enough to see the kitchen staff frozen in place, the house manager flipping through a clipboard, Evelyn standing rigid at the island with her jaw set too tight. "What now?" he asked. No one answered right away. The silence was strange, not dramatic, not loud, just wrong, like a house holding its breath. Evelyn turned to the young temp from the agency, a blonde woman who had only started 3 days ago and still wore her employee badge too high on her chest. "Did you call her?" Evelyn demanded. The girl blinked. "I called the number on file, ma'am, but no one picked up." "Then text her." "I did." And another pause. Nothing. Ethan's fork slipped from his fingers and hit the china with a sharp little clink. Chloe exhaled hard and crossed her arms. "This is insane," she said. "She knows I have fittings at 10. William finally pulled the Bluetooth from his ear. "Who are we talking about?" he asked, more annoyed than concerned. Evelyn stared at him, then around the kitchen, as if the answer should have been obvious to everyone. It wasn't. The temp swallowed. "The housekeeper, sir." William frowned. "Which one?" No one spoke. Not Chloe. Not the house manager. Not even Evelyn, who suddenly looked offended by the question and yet unable to answer it. Across the room, Margaret's fingers tightened slightly on her cane. Morning light spilled across the marble floor in long pale bars, catching the untouched coffee, the unopened pills, the small smear of jam on Ethan's cuff, and the empty doorway at the back of the kitchen where soft footsteps usually appeared before dawn. For the first time in years, the Whitmore family felt the shape of a missing person without knowing the sound of her name. The house did not fall apart all at once. It came undone in small, humiliating ways, the kind no one noticed until they began stacking on top of one another like plates set too close to the edge. Ethan refused the eggs after one bite because the fork on his right side was the heavy silver one he hated, not the lighter one with the narrow handle, and he pushed back from the table with his lower lip trembling. Chloe disappeared upstairs, only to shout a minute later that her white dress had not been steamed, and the hem still carried the faint crease from the boutique packaging. William found his navy tie at last, but it had not been laid out with the matching cuff links, and he stood in front of the hallway mirror with his collar open, staring at his own reflection as if disorder were a personal insult. In the middle of it all, the kitchen smelled wrong. Not bad, exactly, just incomplete. The coffee was too bitter, the toast too dark, the lemon oil on the counters too sharp. Usually there was a softer note underneath everything in the morning, something warm and clean that settled over the room before the family came downstairs, but today the air felt scrubbed of comfort. Evelyn moved from station to station in her cream silk blouse, correcting details with clipped precision, yet every correction seemed to reveal another mistake. The flowers in the breakfast room had not been turned toward the light. Margaret's tea had steeped too long. Ethan's lunchbox sat open on the island, missing the crackers that had to be packed separately because of his allergies. "Who packed this?" Evelyn asked, holding it up between two fingers as though it had personally offended her. No one answered. The agency temp looked close to tears. The chef stared down at a cutting board full of melon cubes, suddenly fascinated by geometry. Margaret watched them all in silence. She had lived long enough to recognize the difference between inconvenience and truth, and this morning the truth was moving through the house like cold air under a door. She reached for her pill organizer, then stopped. One compartment was still full. Another was empty when it should not have been. Her brow tightened. "William," she said softly. He did not hear her the first time. He was in the foyer now, asking the driver whether the town car had been detailed, because the rear seat smelled faintly of yesterday's rain. "William." Margaret's voice carried on the second try, thin but firm. He turned, distracted. "What is it, Mother?" She looked down at the pills, then toward the back hallway where the service stairs curved up behind a narrow white door. Every morning for nearly 6 years, someone had appeared from that door before 7, quiet as a shadow, with hot water, the correct tablets, one full glass, and a second folded napkin because Margaret's hands had grown less steady in winter. No one else had ever remembered the second napkin. The realization seemed to move across the room in pieces. Evelyn noticed the unopened medication. Ethan began crying again because the label on his water bottle was peeling off. Chloe came down with one shoe in her hand and asked why no one had called the dry cleaner. William checked his watch, then looked around as though the answer might be standing in plain sight. But all he saw were polished counters, silver fixtures, and the pale morning sun pooling across the marble floor. For years they had mistaken smoothness for self-maintaining order. They had assumed the beds made themselves, the shirts returned pressed, the calendars aligned, the medicines sorted, the children remembered. The old woman watched. Standing there in the gleam of their own expensive kitchen, the Whitmores began to feel something they had never made room for before, the quiet weight of dependence. By 9:30, the embarrassment had settled into something heavier than inconvenience. It sat in the breakfast room with the untouched tea, followed William down the hall as he barked into his phone, and clung to Evelyn even as she tried to recover the morning by controlling the next 5 minutes. "Get me her file," she said at last, turning to the house manager with a tone sharpened by the fact that she had already waited too long to ask. Randall Mercer, who had worked for the Whitmores for 11 years and prided himself on keeping every detail in order, gave one tight nod and disappeared toward the office near the back staircase. The family remained where they were, not because anyone had asked them to stay, but because leaving would have felt like admitting too much. Chloe stood by the island in a cashmere wrap, scrolling without seeing anything on her screen. Ethan sat curled sideways in his chair, wiping at his face with the sleeve Naomi usually reminded him not to use. Margaret kept her eyes on the service door. She did not look angry. That was somehow worse. When Randall returned, he held a slim gray folder and a folded sheet of printed emergency contacts. He glanced at Evelyn, then at William, as though suddenly aware that what had been ordinary information 5 minutes ago was now evidence. "Her name is Naomi Carter," he said quietly. The kitchen went still again. Chloe lifted her head first. "Naomi," she repeated, and the name sounded unfamiliar in her mouth, like a word from a class she had not studied for. William took the folder, opened it, and stared down at the typed line near the top as if the letters might rearrange themselves into someone easier to dismiss. Naomi Carter. Start date, 6 years ago. Emergency contact, Samuel Carter. Address, a modest apartment 12 miles away. Position, household operations and personal support. He frowned at that last phrase. "What exactly is household operations and personal support?" he asked. Randall hesitated. "Sir, it was expanded over time. Miss Carter handled the upstairs linen schedule, Miss Chloe's wardrobe prep for events, Master Ethan's lunch packing and allergy notes, Mrs. Whitmore's medication timing, and most of the day-to-day household continuity." "Continuity," William repeated, almost offended by the word. Margaret let out a soft breath through her nose. "That means she remembered what the rest of you did not," she said. No one answered her. Evelyn reached for the folder, flipping through documents too quickly at first, then slower. There were signed delivery forms, dry cleaning receipts, a pediatric dietary chart in Ethan's file, all neatly highlighted, a handwritten list of Margaret's evening preferences in careful blue ink. At the bottom of 3 different pages was the same signature, small and elegant. Naomi Carter. Chloe leaned over her mother's shoulder, staring at the name as if she were seeing a face begin to form in fog. "I thought her name was Nora," she said, almost to herself. Randall did not correct her. He did not need to. Across the room, Ethan sniffled and looked up. "Miss Naomi cuts my apples thin because I do not like the skin pulling," he said. It was such a small sentence, spoken in the plain voice of a child, but it landed harder than anything else had that morning. Evelyn closed the folder. For the first time since sunrise, her expression shifted from irritation to something quieter, something far less comfortable. Shame did not arrive with noise. It arrived with detail. A name on paper. A child remembering kindness. An old woman waiting for the right pills. And somewhere beyond the polished walls of the Whitmore estate, while they stood in a bright kitchen learning the identity of the woman who had carried their lives in silence, Naomi Carter had already been gone for hours. The morning had started much earlier for Naomi Carter, long before the Whitmores came downstairs to polished counters and pressed opinions. At 5:12, the service entrance had clicked shut behind her with its usual tired rattle, and cold spring air still clung to the hem of her charcoal coat. She had paused in the back hallway only long enough to tie on her apron, smooth a hand over the loose strands of hair at her temple, and glance at the yellow legal pad she kept folded inside her tote. The list for the day had already been written in neat, slanted lines. Steam Chloe's white dress, switch William's navy tie after weather update, refill Mrs. Whitmore's evening organizer. Separate Ethan's almond-free snacks, call florist, rotate lilies in breakfast room, remind chef no kiwi near lunch prep. Nothing on the page mentioned how tired she was. Nothing mentioned the call she had gotten at 11:40 the night before from St. Agnes Medical Center, when a night nurse with a careful voice explained that her father's blood pressure had dropped again during dialysis. Naomi had thanked her, written down the extension number, and gone back to ironing a table runner under the dim bulb of her apartment kitchen. By 5:30 that morning, she was already moving through the Whitmore house with the silent accuracy of someone who had memorized its pulse. She reset the thermostat in the breakfast room because Margaret always felt a chill by the windows. She swapped the heavy silver fork at Ethan's place for the lighter one with the narrow handle. She checked the weather and changed William's tie choice from burgundy to navy because the television interview scheduled after his board call would look better under cool studio lights. Upstairs, she slipped into Chloe's dressing room and unzipped the garment bag just enough to let the white fabric breathe before steaming out the fold at the hem. She did not need to be thanked to know it mattered. She only needed the house to keep moving. At 6:10, she entered Margaret's sitting room with hot water, 2 pills, 1 full glass, and the extra folded napkin. The old woman looked up from a half-finished crossword and gave her the same small nod she gave every morning, the kind that acknowledged effort without turning it into spectacle. "You look worn thin, child," Margaret murmured. Naomi smiled, though it cost her something. "Just a long night, ma'am." Margaret's eyes rested on her for a second longer, soft with the sort of attention that made Naomi want to look away. "You should not pour from a pitcher that is already empty." Naomi lowered her gaze to the pill case. Some days do not leave much choice. She moved on before kindness could become dangerous. In the kitchen, Evelyn spoke into her phone without glancing up, asking whether the caterer had confirmed Friday's tasting. Chloe breezed through in silk pajamas, holding out a dress without making eye contact. "This one too," she said, already turning away. William spilled coffee on the cuff of his shirt 10 minutes later and handed the jacket off behind him as casually as another man might set down a newspaper. Naomi took it, blotted the stain, and returned it before he ended his call. Not one of them looked at her long enough to see the strain behind her calm, the stiffness in her shoulders, or the way her phone vibrated twice in the pocket of her apron before she finally stepped into the pantry and saw the hospital's number glowing on the screen. Naomi let the pantry door rest lightly against the frame before answering, as if even the click of the latch might be one sound too many in a house that already took everything from silence and gave nothing back. "This is Naomi Carter," she said in a low voice, one hand pressed against the shelf where rows of imported olive oil and polished cereal canisters stood in perfect order. The nurse from St. Agnes spoke gently, but not softly enough to hide the urgency. Her father had become disoriented after treatment. His pressure had dropped again. The doctor wanted a family member there if possible. Naomi closed her eyes for one brief second, the the fluorescent pantry light pale against her lids. "Is he stable?" she asked. There was a pause, the kind that told the truth before the words did. "He is resting now, but you should come as soon as you can." Naomi thanked her, asked for the room number twice so she would not forget it, and ended the call without letting her voice crack. For a moment, she stood there breathing in the mixed scent of cardboard, spice jars, and lemon polish from the corridor, feeling the day split in two beneath her feet. On one side was the man who had raised her alone after her mother died, who still apologized whenever a hospital bill came in, as if sickness were a debt he had chosen. On the other side was the house outside that door, already leaning on her in 100 invisible ways before most of its people had even finished breakfast. She slipped the phone back into her apron, straightened her shoulders, and walked out. The kitchen had changed tempo while she was gone. Ethan was refusing orange slices because they had touched strawberries on the same cutting board. Chloe had left a pair of earrings on the island beside a half-finished smoothie and a ring of condensation that would stain if no one caught it now. Evelyn was scanning a printed itinerary with the clipped impatience of someone angry that time moved at all. Naomi crossed to the counter, lifted the glass, wiped the circle clean, and began resetting the lunch containers in silence. That was when she saw Margaret's updated medication sheet beneath a stack of catering notes. Someone from the pharmacy had delivered a refill the day before. The labels looked nearly identical, same white bottles, same navy print, same dosage line tucked beneath the physician's name. But one tablet was meant for evening and one only after meals. The organizer upstairs had been filled according to the old schedule. Naomi felt a small current of alarm move through her chest. Not panic. Not yet. Just the sharp instinct that came from years of catching tiny mistakes before they became large ones. She picked up the sheet, checked it twice, then walked toward the breakfast room, where Evelyn stood near the windows with her coffee. "Mrs. Whitmore," Naomi said carefully, stopping at the exact polite distance she had learned was safest. "I think there may be a problem with Mrs. Whitmore's medication timing. The refill instructions are different from the old chart, and I do not want her taking the wrong one on an empty stomach." Evelyn did not look up right away. She finished reading one line of her schedule first, then lowered the page with visible restraint, as though being interrupted by concern itself were somehow rude. Her eyes moved from Naomi's face to the paper in her hand, and then away again. "Leave it with Randall," she said. "I do not have time for side issues this morning." Naomi held the sheet a little tighter. "Ma'am, I really think it should be checked now." Something cool entered Evelyn's expression then. Something smooth and dismissive. Around them the breakfast room gleamed with expensive calm, but Naomi could feel the old lesson settling over her once again. In that house, she was trusted with everything except the right to matter. Naomi did not move right away. The medication sheet remained in her hand, the paper already warming beneath her fingers, while Evelyn Whitmore lifted her coffee and looked past her toward the terrace, as if the conversation had already ended. Sunlight spilled across the breakfast room windows in clean white bands, touching the crystal vase at the center of the table and the untouched plate of toast beside Margaret's seat. Everything in the room looked composed. Only Naomi felt the crack running through it. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said again, softer this time but steadier. "The labels are nearly identical. That is what worries me. If the morning dose is taken the old way, it could make her dizzy before lunch." Evelyn exhaled through her nose and set the cup down with careful precision. "I heard you the first time," she said. "Leave the paperwork with Randall. We are already behind." Naomi lowered her eyes for a second, not in surrender, but in control. She had learned long ago that in houses like this, emotion from people like her was treated as disorder, and disorder was never forgiven. Across the room, Chloe came in at a quick, irritated pace, holding her phone and one pearl earring between her fingers. "Mom, the driver says we have to leave in 12 minutes if I am making the fitting, and nobody has found the nude heels." She stopped when she noticed Naomi still standing there with the paper. "What now?" she asked. Evelyn did not answer immediately. Naomi could feel the moment tightening, the way it always did when practical concern crossed the invisible line into a rich family's sense of territory. "It is about Mrs. Whitmore's medication," Naomi said before Evelyn could wave her off again. "The refill instructions changed. I only wanted to make sure the timing was correct." Chloe looked from Naomi to her mother. then gave a small laugh that was not cruel enough to sound shocking and not kind enough to be harmless. She always does this, Chloe said, brushing her hair back from one shoulder. Acts like she is part of every conversation. The words were light, almost absent-minded, but they landed with the dull force of something familiar. Naomi felt them in the same place she had felt 100 smaller things over the years, every snapped finger, every unfinished thank you, every order given without eye contact. Evelyn did not correct her daughter. That, more than the sentence itself, told Naomi what she needed to know. Margaret, however, lifted her chin from the table. Chloe, she said, her voice thin but edged with steel, the girl is trying to. Keep me upright. Chloe's expression shifted, embarrassed for half a second, but she recovered quickly. I did not mean anything by it, Grandma. That has been the problem in this house for a very long time, Margaret replied. William passed through the doorway at that exact moment, phone in hand, jacket over his arm, and caught only the tail end of the silence. What is going on now, he asked. Evelyn reached for efficiency the way other people reach for prayer. Nothing, she said. A scheduling issue. Naomi looked at William, then at Margaret's pills still resting untouched beside the teacup, then back at the sheet in her hand. Her phone vibrated once in her apron pocket. She did not need to check it to know who it was. For one suspended breath, the whole morning seemed to hold still around her. The polished table, the expensive light, the daughter adjusting an earring, the mother refusing to listen, the old woman waiting, and somewhere across town her father lying in a hospital bed with no one beside him. Naomi folded the medication sheet in half, then in half again, and something inside her, quiet and overused and tired to the bone, finally began to pull away. Naomi slipped the folded medication sheet into the front pocket of her apron and stepped back before anyone could mistake her silence for agreement. William had already turned half away, his attention caught by the glow of his phone, and Chloe was asking Randall whether the heels from the Madison fitting had been moved to the cedar closet upstairs. Evelyn picked up her coffee again with the settled confidence of a woman certain the room would continue obeying her once she stopped looking at it. Only Margaret watched Naomi closely, and in that brief, quiet gaze there was something like apology, though it was not hers to carry. Naomi gave the older woman the smallest nod, the kind that said more than speech could safely hold. Then she moved through the breakfast room without another word. The house did not notice her leaving at first because it was too used to her moving soundlessly through its edges. She went to the upstairs laundry room and turned off the steamer before it hissed dry. She laid Chloe's white dress across the padded hanger with tissue at the shoulders so the fabric would not crease on. The drive. She placed William's navy tie and matching cuff links on the walnut tray beside his watch. In Ethan's lunch tote, she replaced the contaminated snack bag with a safe one from the pantry reserve and wrote in neat block letters on a sticky note, "No strawberries near this container." She took Margaret's pill organizer from the side table, emptied the incorrect compartments, and refilled them according to the new pharmacy sheet, adding one handwritten line beneath the lid in blue ink, "Morning tablet only after food. Watch for dizziness." It was not dramatic work. No music swelled for it. No one stood in a doorway suddenly transformed by guilt. It was simply the last round of care from a woman who had spent too many years making herself smaller than the labor she carried. At the end of the hall, she stopped by the small built-in desk no one in the family used anymore, the one tucked between the service stairs and the mudroom, and pulled a plain cream envelope from her tote. She wrote for the Whitmores across the front in steady script, then slid inside a short set of notes. Ethan's allergy reminders, Margaret's updated dosage timing, the florist's number, the driver's alternate route for school traffic, the location of Chloe's nude heels, and the dry cleaning ticket William would ask for by noon. On a second sheet, after a pause long enough for her hand to tremble once, she added the hospital name, her father's room number, and beneath it only one sentence. "I am sorry for the inconvenience, but I need to be with my family today." She did not sign the note at first. Then she looked at the blank space at the bottom and, with something between dignity and exhaustion, wrote her full name. Naomi Carter. Downstairs, Ethan laughed suddenly at something on his tablet, then began coughing because he had reached for the orange juice too quickly. A cabinet shut. A heel clicked across marble. Life in the house went on, bright and expensive and unaware. Naomi removed her apron, folded it neatly over the back of the chair, picked up her coat, and stepped out through the service entrance into the sharp morning air. The wind caught at the edge of her scarf as she walked down the side drive toward the bus stop beyond the iron gate. She did not look back at the windows. She did not need to. For 6 years, she had been the unseen hand keeping that house from slipping out of rhythm. Now, for the first time, she let it miss a beat. At 10:17, the envelope was still sitting on the built-in desk by the service stairs, half hidden beneath a stack of takeout menus and a glossy school fundraiser packet no one remembered bringing inside. The cream paper caught a stripe of sunlight from the narrow hall window, plain and patient, while the rest of the house moved past it in increasing disorder. Upstairs, Chloe was late and furious because the nude heels she swore had vanished were, in fact, in the lower cedar closet exactly where Naomi had left them, but no one thought to look there until Randall found them 10 minutes after the driver had already started the car. In the breakfast room, Ethan refused to drink from the blue bottle because the sticker on the lid was crooked, and when the replacement cup arrived it had been rinsed with lemon soap. He could taste immediately. He began coughing, then crying, not from danger but from the small overstimulation that Naomi usually caught before it spiraled. William missed the first 5 minutes of his board call because the investor packet he needed had not been placed in the leather briefcase by the foyer bench. It was eventually discovered in the study printer tray, exactly where it had finished printing at 6:42, untouched because the one person who always checked the tray had not been there to do it. Every inconvenience seemed trivial by itself, but the house had begun to reveal its dependency in layers, and with each layer came a sharper kind of embarrassment. Margaret felt it most clearly. She sat in her chair by the window with the pill organizer resting on her lap, staring at the neatly corrected compartments and the handwritten warning under the lid. Morning tablet only after food. Watch for dizziness. Naomi's script was unmistakable, calm even in urgency. Margaret ran one finger over the blue ink, then looked toward the hallway. "Randall," she called. He appeared a moment later, already flushed from putting out crises upstairs. "Yes, Mrs. Whitmore." She held up the organizer. "She fixed this before she left." Randall nodded slowly. "It appears so." Then, she knew no one listened. The words settled between them heavier than either man or woman in that house wanted to carry. Downstairs, Evelyn had moved from irritation into the brittle efficiency that always came when control began slipping through her hands. She was on her second call with the florist, correcting a centerpiece issue Naomi had warned about the day before, and trying not to notice that the lilies in the breakfast room had already turned too far away from the light. William stepped in from the front drive with his jaw tight and his suit collar slightly crooked. "The car smells like wet dog," he said. "Has no one aired it out?" Randall looked at him for one long second before answering. "Miss Carter usually left the rear windows cracked in the garage for 10 minutes after stormy nights, sir." William fell silent, not because the answer was rude, but because it exposed too much. Every smooth surface in the Whitmore home now carried the outline of absent labor. Every mistake was a negative image of her care. It was Ethan, of all people, who finally wandered toward the service hall in search of the colored pencils Naomi kept in the drawer near the mudroom bench. He found the envelope first. He picked it up with both hands, stared at the writing on the front, and frowned. "Mom," he called, his voice small but clear through the hall. "It says this is for us." Evelyn took the envelope from Ethan with the distracted impatience of someone expecting one more minor inconvenience, and not a reckoning. She broke the seal with one manicured thumb, unfolded the first sheet, and her eyes began moving across the page with the quick, practiced scan she used for guest lists, contracts, and school calendars. But after the second line, her pace changed. The room around her seemed to lose sound. Randall stepped closer. William came in from the foyer, still holding his phone. Chloe hovered by the staircase, one heel on, one off, irritation fading into curiosity. Even Ethan stopped fidgeting. The note was not emotional. That was what made it hit harder. It was precise, orderly, and generous in a way none of them had earned. Ethan's lunch backup is in the second pantry drawer, left side, marked in green because of his almond allergy. Mrs. Whitmore's morning tablet must only be taken after food. The florist confirmed delivery between 11 and 11:30. Chloe's nude heels are in the lower cedar closet beneath the winter shawls. Mr. Whitmore's dry cleaning ticket is in the ceramic bowl by the mudroom keys. There was no accusation in any of it. No bitterness. Just care, itemized and handed over one last time to people who had rarely noticed they were receiving it every day. Evelyn turned to the second page. The top line was shorter. My father was admitted to St. Agnes Medical Center this morning. Room 418. I need to be with my family today. Beneath that, after a small space, was the signature that all of them had now seen more times in a single hour than they had acknowledged in 6 years. Naomi Carter. William stared at the page as if he were looking for some hidden edge in it, some place where resentment should have been. She left all this? He asked. Randall nodded once. It appears she prepared everything before going, sir. Margaret sat straighter in her chair, the corrected pill organizer still resting on her lap. Of course she did, she said quietly. That woman has been mothering this house while the rest of you mistook it for good management. No one answered her because there was nothing to say that would not sound smaller than the truth. Chloe reached for the paper and read the first lines again, slower this time. The color in her face shifted when she got to the note about the shoes. It was such a small detail, but that was the cruelty of realization. Shame did not always arrive through grand moments. Sometimes it came through the memory of handing someone a wrinkled dress without looking at her face. Sometimes it came through recognizing your own life written in another person's careful handwriting. Ethan tugged at Evelyn's sleeve. Is Miss Naomi sad? He asked. The question passed through the room like a draft through an unsealed window. Evelyn opened her mouth, but no answer came. She looked down at Naomi's name again, then toward the back hall where the service stairs disappeared upward behind a white door. For years she had treated that hallway like part of the architecture, useful but forgettable. Now it felt like evidence. William took the pages from her and read them in silence. Then he turned to Randall. Why was none of this ever in the staff brief? Randall met his gaze without blinking. Sir, it was never just staff work. The words landed cleanly. William looked back at the signature one more time, and for the first time that day his voice lost its edge. Get the car, he said. We are going to St. Agnes. The drive to St. Agnes felt longer than the 12 miles Randall quoted from the staff file, perhaps because no one in the back seat knew what to do with the silence. William sat nearest the window with Naomi's note folded once in his hand, not reading it anymore, only holding it as if the paper itself had weight. Evelyn kept her eyes forward, posture perfect, fingers locked too tightly around her phone. Chloe had come without arguing for the first time all day, her white dress still in its bag beside her, her expression stripped of the easy impatience she wore at home like perfume. Ethan sat between them with his backpack on his knees, unusually quiet, tracing the zipper with one finger. Outside, the town changed block by block. The stone gates and clipped hedges of their neighborhood gave way to narrower streets, small brick apartment buildings, laundromats, a corner store with faded lottery signs in the window, a church with a peeling white steeple. It was all part of the same city they liked to say they knew, yet it felt unfamiliar from behind the dark glass of the town car. When they pulled beneath the hospital awning, the first thing William noticed was not the building itself, but the absence of polish. No marble shine, no fresh lilies, no scented air. Just automatic doors, the smell of antiseptic, the low murmur of televisions mounted near the ceiling, and people sitting with the particular stillness of those who had been waiting a long time. Room 418 was on the 4th floor. The elevator hummed on the way up, and every number lighting above the doors seemed to sharpen the discomfort in all of them. By the time they stepped into the corridor, even Ethan understood enough to walk softly. Naomi was not hard to find. She was seated just outside the room beside a wide window washed in pale afternoon light, still wearing the same dark sweater from the morning, but without her apron, without the posture of someone bracing to be useful before anyone asked. Her shoulders were bent with a fatigue that looked older than the day. One paper cup of coffee sat untouched near her knee. In her lap rested a clipboard and a stack of hospital forms. One corner creased where her hand had held it too long. For a second, none of them spoke. They had seen Naomi every day for years, yet not like this. Not in ordinary clothes. Not under harsh hospital lighting. Not with exhaustion written openly across her face and no elegant room around her to absorb it. She looked up at the sound of their steps, and surprise passed through her features so quickly it was almost hidden. Then came caution. She stood at once, out of habit more than comfort. Mr. Whitmore. Mrs. Whitmore. Her voice was calm, but softer than usual, rubbed thin by worry and lack of sleep. She glanced at Chloe, then Ethan, and finally at Margaret, who had insisted on coming despite Randall's objections and now stood with one hand on her cane and one hand on William's arm. Naomi's eyes widened slightly at the sight of her. Mrs. Whitmore, you should not be on your feet this long. The words came to her before anything else. Not why are you here? Not did something happen. Concern, immediate and practical, even now. That was what broke the moment open. Ethan moved first. He stepped away from Evelyn and crossed the polished hospital floor until he stood in front of Naomi, small and earnest, and looking up at her with eyes still red from the morning. Miss Naomi, he said, we learned your name. Naomi blinked once, and the breath she drew in afterward was so slight it might have gone unnoticed in any other room. But in that hallway, under the flat white lights and the soft mechanical beeping from behind the half-closed door, everyone heard it. Naomi looked down at Ethan, and something in her face softened before she could stop it. You did? She asked, her voice almost a whisper. Ethan nodded with solemn pride, as if he had completed a task larger than most adults in the hallway understood. Behind him, the rest of the Whitmores stood suspended in a silence that no amount of money could organize for them. William was the first to move. He stepped forward slowly, not with the brisk certainty he carried through boardrooms and foyers, but with the carefulness of a man entering a truth he had delayed too long. He held the folded note in his hand and looked at Naomi directly, perhaps for the first time, without speaking past her toward a need. Naomi, he said, and the name came out rougher than expected, unfamiliar not because it was difficult, but because it should have been easy years ago. Naomi straightened a little, one hand still resting on the clipboard in her lap. Yes, sir. The old habit in her answer made Chloe look down. Evelyn glanced toward the half-open hospital room, where the soft beep of a monitor stitched itself into the quiet. Through the gap in the door, she could see the edge of a bed, a pale blanket, the shape of an older man sleeping beneath it. The sight seemed to settle something sharp inside her. She had known, in the abstract, that Naomi had a father. The staff file said so. The emergency contact proved it. But abstraction was one thing. A hospital room was another. How is he? Evelyn asked, and even she seemed startled by how small her voice sounded in that corridor. Naomi looked at her for a long second, as if deciding whether the question was real. He is resting, she said. The doctor says they are watching his pressure and adjusting a few things. He was confused this morning. Her fingers tightened slightly on the forms. He kept asking if I had made it to work on time. Margaret closed her eyes at that, just for a beat, and when she opened them again they glistened with the quiet ache of recognition. A good father, she murmured. Naomi gave the faintest nod. Yes, ma'am. Chloe stepped closer then, not all the way, but enough for her shoes to leave the safe distance of polished indifference. Her white dress bag brushed her knee. She looked at Naomi's sweater, at the worn seam near the cuff, at the untouched coffee, at the hospital forms covered in tidy handwriting. Then she said the one thing that had been sitting in her throat since the service hall. I was wrong. Naomi's eyes lifted to hers. Chloe swallowed. About a lot of things. The admission hung there, simple and unadorned. No one rushed to soften it. No one changed the subject. In the room behind Naomi, Samuel Carter shifted faintly in his sleep, and the monitor answered with its calm, steady rhythm. William unfolded Naomi's note, and then folded it again, buying himself 1 second more before speaking. You should not have had to leave instructions for our whole house while your father was being admitted. Naomi did not answer, which made the truth of it even harder to bear. Evelyn's gaze fell to the floor tiles, then rose again. You warned me about Margaret's medication. Naomi remained still. I did. Evelyn drew in a breath that seemed to scrape on the way down. And I dismissed you. This time Naomi answered with more mercy than anyone there deserved. I know it was a busy morning. Margaret let out a soft, almost incredulous sound. Child, she said, do not make excuses for us in a hospital hallway. For the first time all day, a flicker of something almost like warmth passed through Naomi's tired face. It was not a smile. Not yet. But it was the first sign that the wall between service and humanity had begun, however slightly, to crack. For a few seconds, no one moved. The hallway held them there beneath the pale hospital lights, 5 members of one family, standing in the quiet aftermath of seeing themselves clearly. Then William did something Naomi had never seen him do before. He took off his coat, folded it over one arm, and set his phone face down on the windowsill, as if he understood that whatever mattered in that moment could not be managed by barking into a screen. "Naomi," he said again, more firmly this time. "We came here because we owed you more than a note and more than silence." Naomi looked at him without speaking. Her exhaustion had stripped the usual polish from the moment. There was no grand room to absorb discomfort, no polished silver, no service entrance, no place for anyone to hide behind routine. William glanced once at the half-open door to Samuel Carter's room, and then back at Naomi. "Randall told us what you actually do in that house," he said. "Not what your job title says. What you actually do. And I have been thinking all day about how much of my life ran on your memory while I treated your presence like part of the wallpaper." Naomi lowered her eyes for a second, not from submission now, but from the force of hearing something true said aloud at last. Evelyn stepped closer, the hard edge that usually sharpened her voice gone completely. "I should have listened to you this morning," she said. "About Margaret. About all of it. You were trying to protect someone in my family, while your own father was being admitted to the hospital, and I made you feel as though speaking was a burden." The words came slowly, each one seeming to cost her something. "I am ashamed of that." Chloe stood very still beside her mother, one hand curled around the strap of the white dress bag she no longer seemed to care about. "I kept thinking the worst part was that I did not know your name," she said, looking directly at Naomi now. "But it is worse than that. I did not know you because I never bothered to try." Her voice thinned on the last word. "And you still steamed my dress before you left." Something flickered in Naomi's face then, some tired mixture of hurt and grace that could not quite become either one fully. Before she could answer, the monitor inside room 418 gave a small change in rhythm, and all of them turned. Samuel Carter was awake. He looked frail beneath the blanket, his skin ashy with fatigue, but his eyes found Naomi immediately, the way a father's eyes do even through weakness. "Baby girl," he murmured. Naomi went to him at once, taking his hand in both of hers. "I am here, Daddy." His gaze shifted slowly past her shoulder to the people standing in the hallway, dressed in expensive fabrics and carrying the awkwardness of people who had arrived late to something they should have understood years ago. "Your work people?" he asked, voice dry but faintly amused. Naomi hesitated, and William stepped forward before she had to answer alone. "Yes, sir," he said, "and we have not treated your daughter with the respect she deserves." Samuel looked at him for a long moment, then back at Naomi. "I always told her," he said softly, "that kindness is not the same thing as being small." Margaret closed her hand around the top of her cane and nodded once, as if an old truth had just been confirmed by a witness. She trusted. William took out his wallet, then stopped himself, understanding in time that this was not a moment to solve with money alone. Instead, he said, "From today forward, your position, your pay, your schedule, all of it changes if you want it to. We will work around your father's care. We will bring in proper support. And if you choose never to come back, we will still make sure you have what you need." Naomi looked at him, then at Evelyn, Chloe, Ethan, and finally Margaret. The offer mattered, but not as much as the fact that for once it had been spoken to her like she was a person standing in the room, not labor waiting in the next one. Naomi did not answer right away. She stood beside her father's bed with one hand still wrapped around his, feeling the warmth of his skin, the slight rise and fall of his breathing, the real weight of the moment settling where years of exhaustion had lived. Outside the window, late afternoon light had turned thin and pearled, washing the hospital glass in a soft gray glow that made everything look quieter than it had an hour before. Samuel Carter watched his daughter with tired eyes that still held their old steadiness, the kind that had carried her through childhood with more honesty than ease. "What do you want, baby girl?" he asked gently. That question, more than the apology, more than the offer, seemed to reach somewhere deep inside Naomi. For so long, what she wanted had come second to what needed doing. The next load of laundry, the next corrected schedule, the next invisible emergency prevented before anyone noticed it had been there at all. She looked at the Whitmores, really looked at them, and for the first time they did not seem larger than the room. Just human. Flawed. Uncomfortable. Late, but human. "Right now," she said quietly, I want to stay with my father. William nodded at once. Then that is what you should do. No one argued. No one tried to rush her gratitude or dress the moment up in speeches. Evelyn took a slow breath and stepped closer to the bed, not too close, careful now in a way Naomi had never seen from her. We will take care of the rest, she said. And this time, I mean all of it. Chloe slipped the dress bag from her shoulder and set it on a chair, as if appearances had finally lost their place at the center of her world. Ethan moved to Naomi's side and carefully placed something on the blanket near her hand. It was the lighter silver fork from the breakfast table, wrapped in a paper napkin from the car. Naomi blinked in surprise. For the hospital food, he said softly. In case they give you the heavy one. The smallest sound escaped her then. Not quite laughter, not quite tears, but something warm enough to make Margaret look away for a moment and compose herself. That, the old woman murmured, is exactly how care is supposed to travel. The nurse came in a few minutes later to check Samuel's chart and paused when she saw the unexpected gathering around the bed. Naomi began to step back out of habit, ready to clear space. But William moved first, guiding Margaret toward the door and touching Ethan lightly on the shoulder. Evelyn lingered 1 second longer. Naomi, she said, and this time the name was natural. No strain, no delay, just respect where there should always have been respect. We will come back tomorrow, but only if you want us to. Naomi met her eyes and gave a small nod. Tomorrow is fine. It was not full forgiveness. It was something quieter and truer than that. A door unlocked, not thrown open. When the Whitmores finally stepped into the hallway, they carried themselves differently, as if the polished certainty that had once surrounded them had been stripped away and replaced with something humbler, something more useful. Inside the room, Samuel squeezed Naomi's fingers weakly. You hear that? He whispered. They said your name like they finally understood it. Naomi looked toward the half-closed door, where the last of the pale light rested on the floor in one long silver line. Then she looked back at her father, pulled the chair closer, and sat down beside him. The house on the hill would still be standing when morning came, but for the first time in years, it would have to learn how to breathe without borrowing her lungs. And in the quiet